Subaru is weak, like really weak, and he's clever for sure, but he's definitely not a genius either. And as Emilia and Ram constantly criticize him for at the beginning of the show, he has no ambition. But how can anybody be surprised about any of this? His entire life, he's been a loser. When everything started to get hard, he just gave up and locked himself in his room instead of facing his problems. He even says when talking with his imaginary parents that back in his own world, he had fully given up and was just waiting for others to give up on him as well. So why is it that in a form of media filled with perfect and idealistic characters that were born special, born to save the entire world, Subaru stands out? I can't tell you how many TikToks I've seen lately saying that Subaru is the best character in fiction, and I know that's not the most reliable source, but it's clear that there's a massive consensus right now that Subaru is one of the best main characters in recent anime. And the reason for that isn't because he's funny, it's not because he's cool, and it's certainly not because he's strong. Instead, I think the reason is because he's real. Subaru might be one of the most relatable protagonists I have ever seen. And the reason for that is in part because of his power. Now, don't get me wrong, it's an insanely overpowered ability if you really think about it. But as Subaru says himself, it's also pathetic. What kind of hero's greatest ability requires his own death? To everyone around him, he doesn't even have an ability, and the ability that he does have doesn't make him any better or stronger, it just lets him try again. That makes it a lot easier to see yourself in Subaru, because he really is just a normal person living in a fantasy world. He's not some perfect human like Reinhard, blessed with all the abilities and resolve the world has to offer. He's incredibly flawed and even gives up countless times. And that's the real difference between Subaru and other main characters. It's super common in anime for the MC to be physically weak, but Subaru is mentally weak, or more accurately, mentally fragile as well. He doesn't have some unbreakable resolve like Naruto or Itadori, where giving up isn't an option. In fact, there are multiple times in the show where Subaru fully gives up. And the most impactful instance of this is when he tries to get Rem to leave the country with him and live a peaceful life. This is a response that I've never really seen in anime, because Subaru isn't just accepting his fate. He's not dying, he's actively and wholeheartedly giving up and running away once again. He's leaving countless people he cares about behind, even though he knows that he's the only one who can save them. And even though it's incredibly cowardly, it's also incredibly human. It's not the heroic thing to do, sure, but Subaru's already died countless times trying to save them. It's easy for us to look at his decision objectively and say that it's selfish and cowardly, but if you were in the same situation, if you'd gotten your guts cut out of you and watched the people you love die horrifically in front of you multiple times, are you certain that you wouldn't run away too? But regardless, this moment proves that Subaru isn't your average protagonist. In fact, it proves that he probably shouldn't even be the protagonist. Because if it wasn't for Rem's unimaginable belief in him, the story would have ended right there. But this vulnerability and fragility in Subaru's character emphasizes how human he really is, and the audience connects with it. At least for me, a small part of me actually hoped that Rem would take him up on his offer and they could live happily ever after. But there's another aspect of this. Since Subaru is so weak, it gives his actions and choices not only more unpredictability, but also far more weight. When Subaru is convinced by Rem to go back and has a sort of awakening as a person, the moment is so impactful because we know how hard of a decision it is for him to make. But if a character like Naruto were in that position, it would mean practically nothing, because we all know there's no world where he would give up. But Subaru definitely could and even does. That's what makes Subaru feel like a real person. He makes mistakes, he goes back on his word, and completely fails at times. The worst failure of his, in my opinion, is the absolute laughingstock he made of himself at the Royal Selection Conference and his subsequent argument with Emilia. The impact of these mistakes is not that big in the grand scheme of the show, but the impact they had on me was enormous. Watching those scenes honestly made my stomach curl. I was so disappointed by the way Subaru acted at the conference, and his argument with Emilia seriously made me hate him for a couple of episodes. In my head, I was genuinely thinking about dropping the entire show because of how much I started to dislike Subaru. And of course, after a few episodes, I was back to loving him, but I've still never forgotten that visceral reaction those moments left me with. And as weird as it is, I think that's a good thing. They say love and hate are much closer to each other than indifference, and I think that's very true. I've never disliked a main character in any story as much as I disliked Subaru after his argument with Emilia, but it only made his redemption so much better. And I think sometimes we fail to realize that a character you feel neutral or indifferent towards is a much worse character than one you hate. And it all leads back to the raw humanity of Subaru's character. There's no one in your life that you're always happy with 100% of the time, and Subaru is just like that. But the last thing I want to talk about is the irony between Subaru's character and his power, because I think it's subconsciously the most intriguing part of his character. As we talked about in the beginning, Subaru is, or at least starts off, as a complete loser. But the real reason for this isn't because he's weak. You can be weak and still be a hero. He's a loser because he had already given up. But the power he gets is returned by death, which forces him against his will to continue trying, to continue living, and to continue suffering. How beautiful is that? The character who had already given up on himself is given a power that makes it impossible for him to quit. Meaning, there is no escape for Subaru, no matter what. Even death is not peace for him. It's like his divine punishment for running away from his problems in his old life, now forcing him to always face them head on and to keep facing them until he can overcome them. And I think that whether you notice this irony or not, it still has an effect on you, because you can see just how much Subaru struggles internally. He's put into the exact situations that he's most uncomfortable with, and consequently the ones he needs to grow from, allowing him to embark on his own sort of spiritual pilgrimage where he desperately and slowly tries to become a hero even though he isn't one. And everyone can relate to that to some degree, because everyone has things they know they should do but are afraid to face the discomfort that comes with doing them. And Subaru isn't someone who just magically decides he's gonna face his problems all of a sudden. Instead, he gets pushed into it and has to rely on others constantly just to keep going. But that's incredibly inspiring in a way that's far different from your basic protagonist, because it gives you the feeling that you, right now, not some idealistic or perfect version of you, but you can change, and you can become the hero that you want to be, as long as you're willing to face your problems and keep fighting, even if you have to fall, even if you have to rely on others. Just be like Subaru and keep going.